Hello, my name is Dr. Ben Thompson, and today I'm here with Dr. Nina Kraus, PhD scientist, inventor, and amateur musician who studies the biology of auditory learning. Her research is world-renowned and has received 40,000 citations in scientific literature, according to Google. Through a series of innovative studies involving thousands of research participants from birth to age 90, her research has found that our lives in sound, our auditory lives, shape the way that our brain processes sound. Dr. Kraus is here with us today because we're going to spend time talking about brain plasticity for hearing and tinnitus, what we also pronounce as tinnitus. Dr. Kraus has invented new ways to measure the biology of sound processing in humans that provide unprecedented precision and granularity in looking at brain function. And she's now pushing science beyond the traditional laboratory by conducting studies in schools, community centers, and clinics. Today, we'll also be discussing her new book of Sound Mind. Dr. Kraus, welcome to the Treble Health podcast. Would you mind giving us an introduction into plasticity of the brain, which seems to me to be the main pillar of your research over the last decades?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a wonderful show. I've been following it, and I think that you really provide a lot of important information for many people who are increasingly, fortunately, becoming interested in hearing. And it's just such fertile ground. So plasticity, I began my dissertation work. I was recording from single neurons in the auditory cortex of rabbits. And so I had an electrode in a neuron and I played a sound and the neuron responded to that sound because it was a neuron in auditory cortex. Then I taught the animal that the sound had meaning. In other words, that a reward was going to be coming. And so I had the same animal, the same neuron, the same sound. And once the animal learned, the response to that neuron changed. And that to me was seeing firsthand how the hearing brain can change once a sound becomes important to us. And bulk of my work is in humans. And of course, I'm most interested in how we can use the information that we learn from basic science to help us live better, healthier, hearing-themed lives. The fact is that, so this was in my dissertation work decades ago. It was actually the first publication at that time of a single neuron, following a single neuron during the course of learning. And so that was a demonstration of plasticity at the single neuron level, which was kind of a feat, just to be able to hold on to that neuron all that time while the animal learned. And you've heard the expression dumb bunny. So it took a while. But I was able to hold on to those individual neurons and see how they changed. And maybe you can say I just don't have very much imagination, or you can say that I've just been in awe with plasticity in the hearing brain since then. Pretty much, you're right, Ben. Everything that I have done in the past decades has centered around the issue of plasticity and how our lives in sound change our brain.
I want to bring something up to our audience. It's so important, talking about plasticity, the brain's ability to change. So if someone who's listening has bothersome tinnitus, or they're going through this process of what most of our audience has learned is called habituation, meaning the connection between the auditory brain, the emotional brain, can reduce the perception of this unwanted signal or this neutral signal over time. That's the best treatment for tinnitus in 2022, is promoting habituation. So that process for tinnitus and the treatment of hearing loss, which has its own adaptation period as well, they both rely on neuroplasticity. So that to say, anyone who's struggling with tinnitus or hearing loss, which are very common conditions affecting millions of people, will benefit by learning how to promote neuroplasticity. Your book of Sound Mind explains what is neuroplasticity and then gets into some of why it's important. One tidbit that I took out that I want our audience to reflect on here is that sound can heal and sound can damage. And no one knows this better than someone who might for example, have noise-induced hearing loss, and the sound damaged their ears. The sound damaged their hearing, perhaps leading to tinnitus, ringing in the ears, or hearing loss. Well, as audiologists and researchers, we know the sound can heal. Sound therapy, one of my favorite terms in our field, is that the sound can help the brain habituate to tinnitus. And of course, hearing aids are providing sound that can heal someone's communication, allowing them to love their family and be engaged in the communication of what's going on around them. So I want to open this up to you about this concept of how sound can heal and sound can damage, and what you've seen really going deep into these concepts.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, you hit right on the fact that, any therapy for tinnitus is likely to involve multiple brain systems. And a real point in my book is that the hearing brain is vast, and it engages how we think, how we feel, how we move, and our interaction with our other senses. The more formal way of saying is that the hearing brain engages our cognitive, how we think, memory, attention, cognitive, sensory, all of the combined information from our other senses, motor, how we move, and sound itself is movement, and reward, how we feel, systems. So the hearing brain is vast, which also, I think, gives you a lot to work with as a clinician, as an individual person. And it also makes hearing such an important part of our lives. And it's such an under-recognized part of our lives. We live in a noisy world. It's harder to hear subtle cues. We are visually biased in our society. And yet sound and the sound mind, which is really the way in which the brain changes and learns based on the experience with sound, is evolutionarily ancient. So, that said, our experience with sound can be for better and for worse. One of the very best things that you can do for your sound mind is to be a sound expert. So what's a sound expert? That might be a musician. And I'm not talking about being a professional musician. You can see my drums out here. You can
Very nice,
adjust.
very nice. Now I know what you're doing in your breaks during your day.
Well, yeah, and believe me, it's not a matter of being good. It's a matter of engaging regularly with making sound and all of what it entails. So as you make sound, you're listening, you're engaging your other senses, you're moving, you're feeling, you're thinking, remembering, trying to look for patterns. So the cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems are all engaged, and they are all strengthened. So you can engage in making music, and of course singing counts. You can speak another language. You can be an audio engineer like you.
One of the things that comes to mind, which everyone can relate to, is the brain's amazing ability to recall songs from decades previously, where you haven't thought about this song for decades, and then it comes back on and you remember every word. Well, that must be tied to the emotional salience, right?
Well, it's both. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's tied to the emotion. It's also tied to memory. And sound and memory have just an incredibly deep and intertwined marriage. And think about this. Think about the fact that for hundreds of thousands of years, we and organisms all over the place communicated through sound. And sound is our motion sense, our alertness sense. We've only been reading for the past 3,000 years. So, hundreds and thousands of years have gone with sound and memory. You have to remember, if did that sound signal a potential mate? Did it signal food? Did it signal something you'd better not get close to? It's really important to remember. And again, in societies, our societies are really changing. And this is where, I think very much my call to action is something that I know, you are interested in your work. But if you think, people used to be able to remember many things through sound. Before there was writing, we learned about our history through the bards, through sound and song. And the connection between memory and sound is very, very deep. And it's so deep that, even if people are losing their grip on the world with Alzheimer's disease, for example, and dementia, one of the very last things to go is just what you're talking about, Ben, that memory for sound, that memory for meaningful sound, those songs in our past. And that's one of the very last things to go because the link between memory and sound is so deep.
There's some amazing YouTube videos of that and some amazing nonprofits in that space as well. And then on the complete other side of it, we have a military veteran who has PTSD that's triggered by a sound, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And again, the sounds really engage our emotional system. I think in they connect us in the world for better and for worse. And it's all, based on what we have learned. And, the things that we have learned, we can strengthen, we can relearn, and we can also learn to ignore. And that's really the beauty of plasticity, is that with some knowledge, with some understanding, and with working hard on living a life that enhances good hearing, we can change things for the better.
That's right. And for those here in our community, the Treble Health community, those watching on YouTube, listening to this podcast, this message is not foreign, because one of the main messages we have here is that tinnitus is not a loss of some physiological structure that can never come back. In most cases, tinnitus is neurological and can shift over time. Now, if your tinnitus is caused by a permanent hearing loss, well, that hearing is not coming back. However, someone can have much worse hearing loss than me and have no tinnitus, whereas I have no hearing loss and I do have tinnitus. So it's a really important message for a few reasons: to show and to educate and take away that fear and the complexity of this condition, plus to settle the limbic system, to settle the emotional brain, which is so hyperactive in many cases of bothersome tinnitus. So for those listening, that ties in directly to what Dr. Kraus is saying. And in your new book of Sound Mind, which for those listening, you can find it where you find any books, and you can check it out, either read it yourself, listen for yourself. I would recommend it. You have a few sections in there which I want to highlight. Just overall, this idea of the sound mind, how you're explaining how the way that the auditory brain processes sound, the way the brain has all this potential of what it can do, but a certain section of those cells are tasked only to work on sound. And then you go deep in there and you relate it to the average person, as well as giving some educational information as well, which I really enjoy. I enjoyed that balance in your book of focusing on the layperson's everyday experience with sound, communication, noise, music, and then also giving some science and some education behind it. Music, speech, aging, you reference something called our sonic selves. And overall, like, from reading the book, first of all, I can tell that you're a complete science and ear and hearing nerd. Number one. Yes, loud and proud. Number two, I want to share a snippet from it. It's Aging and the Sound Mind. Here we go. This is a quote from your book of Sound Mind. Can improving the sound itself reduce cognitive aging? Older people with hearing loss were given hearing aids for 6 months. Not only was their listening and noise and cognition better, even when their hearing aids were removed, but their sound minds showed signs of reorganizing. That's huge. And tell us, how new is this information? It may have been a theory, but when was it proven?
Yeah. Well, this is pretty new in terms of being proven. And the author of that study, which was published, they wrote it up in the Wall Street Journal, is Samira Anderson, who is a professor at the University of Maryland. And she's an audiologist. She was an audiologist for 30 years. And then she actually came to Brainvolts, to my lab, and earned a PhD. And now she's a tenured professor at the University of Maryland. She's done a lot of work on the aging brain and hearing loss. And the work that she did in my lab showed that the neural response to sound would change with training, with auditory-based training. So she employed a brain fitness program and measured brain responses in individuals before and after the program, hearing and noise and memory and all of that. And these were people who, many of them were older adults with some presbycusis, and they weren't wearing hearing aids. The work that she has more recently done includes people who, in fact, do wear hearing aids. And of course, the whole idea, one of the ideas in my book, and you're right in saying that it's conversationally written, and it has a lot of personal anecdotes, because Science is a deeply personal endeavor, but it is rooted in science. And the idea that the brain will, in fact, really change. If I just step back for a minute, one of the things that we do at Brainvolts is, of course, as I'm talking to you now, the neurons in your brain are responding to sound and they are producing electricity. And we can, with sensors, with scalp electrodes, we can pick up that electricity. And so we can see how good a job your brain is doing at picking up the many ingredients that are in sound. There are ingredients in sound like pitch and timing, timbre, phase, loudness, and all of those ingredients. We hardly even notice sound because it's invisible. And we sure don't even think about often all the different ingredients. But as scientists, we can measure these responses. And this is also what Professor Anderson has done: before and after hearing aids, before and after training. And you can see in the same person how the sound mind, which is the hearing brain that is a combination of cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems, and that is affected by the sounds of our lives. That is the sound mind, how that changes with experience in sound. I also want to take this opportunity to say that you mentioned how the origin of tinnitus is pretty broad, and it's a very common phenomenon, tinnitus. And we also know not so much as we would like to about it, but I think one of the things that complicates it is because we all have our own sound minds, and we can have tinnitus. Each one of us can have tinnitus for different reasons. Enter the audiologist. This is, in my view, such an important role for an audiologist today. In my view, if you want to, quote something from this interview, it is that, I think that audiologists should be ambassadors for the sound mind. And I also think that because each one of us is so different, an audiologist needs to look at each individual person individually. And it's certainly not just a formula of, oh, well, this is just what everybody does for tinnitus. It has to be extremely individual. And again, the idea of an audiology personal trainer. I would love to be able to go to an audiologist who will train me and look at my bottlenecks and my strengths and help me hear better. And again, why do I know this is so important? Because when I measure the brain responses, if I measure your brain responses to sound and my brain responses to sound, it can be the same sound. We will each have our own neural signature. And that signature will be more or less the same over time. Of course, it will change for better and worse based on what we do. But basically, we have a neural signature. And you can see this biologically in waveforms that we record. So another testament to how individual hearing is.
When I was reading your book, what I realized is that the closest author of similar text that I've read is Oliver Sacks, the neurologist, who has written books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, as well as Hallucinations, where he talks a lot about the auditory brain, really, and that balance of conversational reading as well as scientific learning. That's really right where I put your work as well. You have one section of the book called The Listening Brain, a Quest. And similar to what you've shared previously, I'll read another section here. The brain coordinates all its inputs, the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches, guided by a lifetime of accumulated experience into a concrete whole. How does the combination of ever accumulating sensory input produce the knowledge, that's my phone ringing, or I hear my brother pulling into the driveway? Where does the necessary unity come from? Somehow the brain gathers information and binds it into a unified perception. For those who have tinnitus, like you had shared, tinnitus is a complex symptom. Diagnosing the cause can be complex. We know that there are differential diagnoses as doctors, and then the treatments and the therapies should be individualized, personalized, and vary based on someone's unique life situation. For you, this section of the book called The Listening Brain, a Quest. Why is it a quest?
Yeah, well, it's a quest because I was looking for it in my lab, which we call Brainvolts, and please check out our website. You'll find it Brainvolts .northwestern.edu, and you will see, the many studies that we have done, many that have led to the idea of how can we measure sound processing in the brain in a way that reflects the complexity of sound processing. I often think about throughout the book, I talk about sounds outside the head and signals inside the head. And similarly with noise, I talk about noise outside the head and noise inside the head. So we know that sound is complicated. And, as you're recording my voice right now, you know that the sound consists of many different ingredients. Like I mentioned, pitch, timing, timbre. And how can, the quest was, how do we find a way of measuring the brain's response to each one of these ingredients in an individual person? And so one of the metaphors that I use in the book is a metaphor of a mixing board. So if you think of all the ingredients of sound, and you have a mixing bowl, and then you have a mixing board, and the faders go up and down depending on who you are in sound. And so you will have certain strengths and certain bottlenecks. And the responses that we are able to measure now because of our quest, which we continue to be on, is already, we can measure your brain's response to sound. We can see it. We can even play it back through a speaker, and it will resemble the sounds that, we used to stimulate your brain in the first place. And there are many examples of this on our website.
I saw you
So the
speak a
quest
few
is that.
I saw you speak a few years ago in San Francisco, and you played that audio snippet, and by far the coolest part of your lecture was that.
Well, we have lots and lots and lots of examples. And again, we've learned so much from listening to the brain. So, on the one hand, I can see your brain's response to sound, but I can also listen to it. And so we've been listening to, what does sound sound like through a hearing aid? What does sound sound like if you've just sustained a concussion? What does sound sound like if you're a musician? What if you're an old musician with a hearing loss? What if the sound happens in noise? And we can listen to people's brains, and it informs us. So we have really spent a lot of time developing technologies. We call this the frequency following response, the FFR, which is a technology that has already, it's been available for decades and decades before I even started my lab. But we have built on that. That was initially a response to low frequency pure tones. And what we're interested in is, how does the brain respond to speech and music and sounds we care about? And
Excellent.
so over the quest, I wanted to give the reader a sense of, the humanness, the science behind it, just what it's like, a little glimpse of decades of life in a auditory neuroscience lab, trying to, being on the quest to measure sound processing in the brain so we can understand human hearing better.
I'm not going to ask you to play your drum set behind you as much as I want to, but I would like to talk about musicians, tinnitus, the auditory brain. At Treble Health, we have different tinnitus support groups, which are positive, encouraging peer groups to learn from others, have that peer-to-peer support under the guidance of an audiologist. And one of the groups that we launched is a group for musicians who have tinnitus, because as you can imagine, the language is different, the shared experiences are different, the sensitivities are different. What are your thoughts on musicians or music lovers and how their experience with tinnitus or hearing loss is different or unique?
Yeah. Well, again, you certainly can't put musicians in a box and just call them musicians.
Why not? Come on, they're all playing
Well,
in a band. They're all up there together. Isn't there
yeah,
some similar
yeah.
thread? No?
I mean, we're so very, very different as we can just see biologically. And so musicians are different too. But that said, there are generalizations that we can make about musicians. Musicians have spent a lot of time making sound to meaning connections. They have engaged how they think and feel and remember and pay attention and combine their other senses and engage with other people through sound. So they have developed their sound mind, their hearing brain very well. And in fact, just last week, I measured the brain responses of an 86-year-old musician with a significant hearing loss, and his sound mind is just awesome. I mean, his response to sound and his response in noise. Many people, and as you know very well, there are many people who have no hearing loss at all and are very disturbed by background noise. Well, here is a guy who has a very significant hearing loss, and his hearing noise is wonderful, and his brain, it just doesn't lie. His brain responds. So we compared him to norms, because we only have norms around the age of 65-year-old. I mean, he just shot them out of the water because he knows what to listen for. He has developed a sound mind. You might be interested in, and I don't know if you put links up to your shows, but I wrote also a 400-word summary of my perspective. It's called the Beams Hypothesis. It's in hearing research.
We can link it in the description as well as a link to your book. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I talk about the fact that someone like a musician trains their brain. We have pathways that connect the ear to the brain, and then we have other pathways that connect the rest of the brain to the ear. And so much of hearing happens in the brain. I mean, think Beethoven. And over time, we learn to prioritize the sounds of our lives. So even when we're asleep, and if I have electrodes on you, if someone mentions the sound of someone calls your name, your brain, you will just respond automatically, because this is what has happened to your nervous system over time. So clearly, your experience with sound, and if you are a musician, is going to really affect you. Now, musicians often have a hearing loss. It's really, really important for everyone, including musicians, to protect their hearing. And, in my chapter on noise, I spend a lot of time just talking about things that we can all do to protect our hearing in our daily lives and in our noisy world.
Let's talk about that for a moment, and it's a good
Mhm.
transition as we're wrapping up here in the next 5 or 10 minutes the podcast. I want to really open this up to what can we do, and what is the, as you said earlier, the call to action for now that we are educated, now that we have this knowledge, now that we have this research. What is the call to action for individuals with tinnitus, individuals with hearing loss, professionals who are working in this field, researchers, however we want to take this? What is the call to action? What are we doing with this?
Mhm.
Number one, protect the hearing that you do have using earplugs, considering what levels of listening are too loud that can potentially harm us or cause damage. What else? What are your major call to actions that you've been sharing with our communities, Nina?
Yeah. So, in the chapter on noise, I really break that down on a number of levels, because there's noise outside the head. And again, there are two little op-eds that I wrote, one for the Wall Street Journal and the other for the LA Times, about noise. And what was interesting in that, and it's also interesting with my book, is the responses I get from people who say, I had no idea. I had no idea this was a thing, this was important. How crucial sound is what a powerful force sound is in our lives. And so I think step number one is learning, the knowledge of how important sound is, and the awe that comes with that can help us then do the right thing. Because one of the things that is so important is sound connects us more than any other sense. And, even now, you and I, Ben, we're having this conversation, and it's so present. There is this, Ian McGilchrist calls it betweenness, this back and forth, this reciprocity. And, we don't have a script. We're everyday improvisers, and sound is what connects us, and is what really is so much a part of human connection that we're losing in our society. We have a very divisive society. People are alienated and divided, and sound is really a way to bring people together. So if one, of all, really appreciates the importance of sound and the importance of sound for health, mental health, and connection with others, then we can start doing some things. So we can strengthen our sound mind again by engaging with sound through, say, a musical instrument, learning another language, being a bird watcher. Doing things that engage your listening. Importantly, I see people walking with their kids in strollers, and these people they've got a kid there looking up at them, looking up at the leaves and the trees. And I want to shout out there and say, talk to your kid. Don't talk to your phone. And I think that we I love my devices, and they're wonderful. They help us and they connect us in many ways, but they're also ways of disconnecting us. And it's important to talk to your kids. It's important to talk to your kids without distractions, for your kids to be listening at a dinner table and not be shunted off by giving them some kind of device to not be part of the conversation. Conversation is something that you learn, this engagement with people over time. You have to foster that. Read to your kids. Rhythm is such a huge part of our lives. Take your little baby and bang his little toes together and his little feet in time with a little song you're making up. I think that we often put the bar up very high in terms of, I'm not a musician. I have a terrible voice. I can't sing. Doesn't your kid is so happy to have you holding him and singing to him. So, making music as much as possible with our friends and our babies and our loved ones. I mean, I have 3 grown kids. I'm married to a musician, and some of my happiest times are when we get together and we can communicate through sound. That said, I think that becoming aware in our noisy world about what is necessary and what is not necessary. Let me give an example. When you go to an airport is a noisy place. I mean, planes are noisy inherently. Conveyor belts are noisy inherently. But do you need to have, every time a boarding pass is scanned, does everybody at gate 22 have to hear 247 times, beep, 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 right? Do we need to have CNN on? Do we need to be listening to the dude who's watching his ball game on his phone, or the kid who's playing some electronic game? These are things. I mean, just even things like, does my neighbor need to know every time I lock and unlock my car door? You can turn that thing off. Do I have to listen to my dryer telling me that my clothes are dry? And think about it in terms of, again, our sense of alarm and awareness. Many people these days complain that we're losing focus. It's hard to think. Well, why are we losing focus? Because they call them alarms, right? Notifications on our phones and alarms on our computers, and the beeping trucks for every delivery truck. I mean, all of these things alarm us, and they disrupt our ability to have a coherent thought, which actually takes a while to develop. So being aware of these things can help us, I think. You can choose a quieter air conditioner. And the other thing with respect to noise is, we've all had the experience of, there's a truck idling outside and you don't even know that he's out there, but then he turns off the ignition and suddenly, you breathe this sigh of relief. So, the whole time you didn't even know it, but you were in this state of tension, which affects your cardiovascular health. It affects so many things. So being aware of sound and its importance, I think we can do almost, just think about your own life. And this is, again, where an audiologist, I think, can really help an individual person. What is your life like? What do you do? What can you do to minimize the noise in your life and to maximize the richness of sound in your life? And these are questions we should ask ourselves on a personal basis, for our own selves, for our children, for education, for healthcare.
Me personally, I connect with music. I connect with how sound can bring people together, loved ones, family, community, friends. And then also checking in with my environment. Is it unnecessarily noisy? Is it calming and comfortable? Agreed. And thank you, Dr. Nina Kraus, PhD from Northwestern, who has shared so much with us today. Leave a comment below here on YouTube if this was helpful. or educational, please write in the comment below, helpful or educational. And we thank you again for coming and sharing your knowledge. For those who have not already, consider looking at Of Sound Mind, which is Dr. Kraus's new book. And Nina, thank you for being here on the Treble Health Podcast.
Well, Ben, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the important work that you do.
You're welcome.
And I just do want to mention one thing. In the book, there are 80 illustrations, and part of that, I worked in partnership with an artist, and part of the idea is that science is an art, and it's part of the beauty of what we get to deal with as scientists and listeners in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Kraus. Talk to you soon. And for those listening, we'll see you on the next podcast episode. Goodbye.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for watching today's video with Treble Health. Check out our next video by clicking the button on this screen or another recommended video. And if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks so much. See you on the next video.